What are the English language requirements to work as a doctor in Australia? And why is English proficiency such an important issue if you are to work in this country? Well, watch this video to find out. Hi, I'm Anthony, I'm the Career Doctor. I make videos to help other doctors with challenges around medical careers, also for medical students as well. At the moment we're focusing in on international doctors, and we're doing a bunch of videos for international doctors who might be thinking about working in Australia. I've got the next few a couple mapped out, I think, 2 or 3, but I could use your help in terms of other things that you'd like to hear about. So if you do have an idea for the video series or another video in the Career Doctor channel genre, please pop a comment in the comment sections below. We'd love to hear from you. You can also join the International Trainee Doctors support group that we've got going, or if you're already working in Australia, you can join our Trainee Doctors support group as well. And I use those communities to find out what things are important to you and what sort of content you would like me to make. So on to the video. So we're focusing on a series of videos for international doctors to assist with the process of obtaining work in Australia. So there are lots of confusing aspects about becoming registered in Australia. We touched on one of these in the last video, which was the District of Workforce Shortage and Area of Need issue. English language proficiency is another confusing area. There are strict requirements and tests to determine whether a doctor has the required level of English communication skills in Australia. In fact, these requirements generally extend to other health professionals and other groups such as skilled migrants or even students coming to study at university in Australia, although the specific requirements will vary from situation to situation. The dominant language spoken in Australia is English. Australia is in fact a very monolingual country, i.e. we only tend to speak one language. The number of people in Australia who actually speak more than one language is quite low. According to the recent national census in 2016, around 72% or 73% of households only spoke English at home. That rate is coming down from 77% in 2011, but it's still quite high. And it's surprising given that we situate ourselves in the middle of Asia. But in any case, in order to be able to be an effective doctor in Australia, you really do need to be able to communicate in English, because that is the language that other people speak, specifically the patients that you work with. So I think there are 2 key issues here for you to consider in relation to English and working as a doctor in Australia. One is, what English language requirements do I particularly need to demonstrate in order to meet the registration requirements to become a doctor? Without meeting these, of course, you won't be able to get a job and you won't be able to get a visa. So you do need to meet them. But after you do, the second issue to consider is my English language proficiency good enough to land a job as well as work successfully in Australia? In fact, many employers place an even higher emphasis on English proficiency than the minimum requirements of the medical board, because they believe that it's very important to have a high level of English skill in order to be successful as a doctor. And without a high level of English proficiency, you are likely to struggle, because you also need to be able to deal with the nuances of Australian English. Particularly if you're working in areas such as general practice or psychiatry or even emergency medicine, to name just a few, you'll need to know good English. This is because every country, like Australia, has its own version of English. Australia's version of English is subtle at times and not so subtle at times, and it can trip you up. And it's not the same version of English that you may have learned at home or on international courses. There can be some subtle and not so subtle differences that can provide real barriers to your communication. So we'll touch on this issue towards the end of the video, but I bet you're wanting to know what the actual requirements for English proficiency are. So let's get straight into them. The best source of information for what you may need to demonstrate in terms of English proficiency is the website called AHPRA. This stands for the Australian Health Practitioners Regulation Agency, and you can think of it as the overall body that governs all the other national health boards in Australia, including the Medical Board of Australia. In fact, the Medical Board of Australia website is hosted off the AHPRA website. So there's lots of useful information there, and I'll post some links to the pages that are useful in the comment sections below. On this website you can read about the pathways to English proficiency as well as other pathways to registration, which I'll talk about in a future video. First thing that you'll actually discover if you read this website is that everybody needs to demonstrate English proficiency, even Australian doctors. In fact, I've known a few cases where Australian medical students have had to sit one of the English requirement tests because they haven't been able to provide the evidence of high school attendance in Australia. So here are your options. Firstly, you can provide evidence that English is what's called your primary language. But this category only applies to certain people who've studied secondary school in one of what's called a recognised country. Secondly, you may be able to provide evidence of enough combined secondary education and university education that has occurred in English. Again, this needs to be one of those recognised countries. Thirdly, you may be able to produce evidence that you've done at least 6 years full-time equivalent university study in a recognised country that's linked to your profession. Fourthly though, you may have to sit a specific test to prove your proficiency. In fact, many international doctors end up having to sit one of these tests because the other three pathways are a little bit limited. So let's talk about the first three pathways and then get on to the tests. Let's particularly talk about what recognised countries are. AHPRA has determined that the following countries are what is termed a recognised country. Australia, obviously, New Zealand, Canada, the United Kingdom, the United States of America, South Africa, and the Republic of Ireland. Apart from South Africa, these are also the countries that the Department of Immigration determines where English language is okay. South Africa is included because it was included in the days when there wasn't a national medical board, but there were state boards that recognised South Africa as having an equivalent system. Interestingly, these countries are also the ones that are deemed competent authorities when we come to registration pathways, which we'll talk about in another video. So basically, if you can provide evidence that you did your high school certificate in Australia and then went to a medical school in one of these recognised countries, you're okay. Similarly, if you can show that you've done at least 2 years secondary schooling in a recognised country and then a medical degree in a recognised country, you're okay, or the 6 years full-time equivalent study in a recognised country in English. But I should say that you do need to check with AHPRA because conditions vary from circumstance to circumstance, and I wouldn't want you to rely completely on this information, which is general. Sometimes their interpretation of things like full-time or continuous study, etc., can be a little bit tricky. There are also a couple of other exemptions for doctors specifically before we get to the tests. So if you've completed the PLAB in the UK or what's called the New Zealand REX in New Zealand, that is also considered that you have proven your English language proficiency. Following me so far? Good. So as I say, for many of you, you'll actually need to do one of these tests that prove your proficiency in English. There are 4 tests that are considered okay for that purpose. These tests are used by the national boards to determine English competence for a range of health professions. They're also, as I said, used by the Department of Immigration for similar purposes. Each test is slightly different, but they've apparently been calibrated in terms of the marks that you required so that they are equivalent. And according to AHPRA, there's no difference between sitting one test or the other in terms of the challenge. So essentially, it's not easy to achieve a good result on one test or another. So the recognised tests are the International English Language Testing System, the Pearson Test of English academic version, the Test of English as a Foreign Language internet-based test, and the Occupational English Test. AHPRA advises that you need to choose the test that's right for you. Most international doctors do the International English Language Testing System test, or the IELTS, because it's the most popular and most widely known, and also the one that seems to have the most tests available. Of all the complaints I hear from international doctors about the 4 tests, the one I also hear the most complaints about is the IELTS. But I don't really know whether that's because it's the one that most of them do, or there are specific issues in relation to that test. I'd be interested to hear some comments from those who might have gone through one or more of those tests as to whether they think one testing system is fairer than the other. In terms of complaints, as I said, I've known native speaking colleagues who've managed to fail one of these tests, which highlights an important point, I think. These tests are really tests of your academic or professional English skills, and they are international tests. So they are more valid measures of how you might effectively communicate with other doctors and health professionals, and not necessarily patients in Australia. I'll leave some links to the AHPRA web pages and where you can go to find these tests online in terms of information as well. I'll also put some links to resources that might help you to practice and prepare for those tests. Some of those links may be affiliate links, which means that if you do go along and then you do decide to purchase something from that site, a small amount might come back to me to help me with the channel. And if you do that, I really appreciate you doing it for me. There are a few important things to note about these tests. First, these tests are pretty hard, so you do need to practice and prepare for them. For example, with the IELTS test, you need a minimum score of 7 out of 9 in all 4 domains. That's listening, reading, writing, and speaking. So you definitely need to take them seriously and put in some time to practice. As I said, I've had native speaking colleagues fail some of these tests. Secondly, AHPRA only lets you sit 2 tests in a 6-month period, And so you can't just keep serially sitting tests and hoping that you pass one. And you do have to pass one of those tests overall. So you can't combine passing bits from one test and another and say that you've achieved proficiency. Thirdly, there is a time limit on these tests. Generally speaking, it's 2 years before AHPRA will ask you to do a repeat of the test. There are some specific circumstances where you may not need to, but in general, it is that 2-year limit. Finally, these tests are only required for the initial registration, which means that if you become registered, you don't need to keep proving your English proficiency. It's assumed that if you're continually registered in Australia and working as a doctor, that you're keeping up your English language skills. So it's only required the first time, or perhaps if your registration lapses. So that's the formal requirements for English. But what about the just as important informal requirements? So as I said, I think it's important for international doctors to know that employers place a premium on English language proficiency, in some ways higher than what the minimum requirements for the medical board may be. Remember that IELTS score of 7 out of 9? Well, that actually apparently equates to a good working use of English. What many employers are looking for is a very good, which is an 8 out of 9, or even expert, which is 9 out of 9. So if you are one of these international doctors that is required to do one of these tests, it's worth making the effort to see if you can score a little bit higher than the minimum requirement, because that might improve your candidacy when you're applying for jobs versus other candidates who might have the minimum scores. Along that lines, employers do look at other evidence for your English proficiency, particularly your written communication. So be careful about putting together your emails and making sure that they're written in formal and appropriate language. And make sure that you've had your CV or resume reviewed by someone to make sure it's in the appropriate form for the Australian employer. It has all the spelling correct and grammar is also correct. Finally, just as I've highlighted already, just because you meet the medical board requirements or even the requirements of an employer doesn't mean that you're going to be successful in your use of English in Australia. It's worth also spending some time familiarising yourself with the nuances of Australian English. Watch some Australian TV, watch some Australian films. Very shortly, you will notice that there is quite specific jargon in Australia. We call that slang here. So as an example, if a patient you see tells you that they are feeling a bit crook, they do not mean that they have just committed a bank robbery. They mean that they're feeling unwell, usually in a general sense and in a non-specific sense, perhaps a viral illness or some sort of gastrointestinal problem. There's lots of slang to get used to here in Australia working as a doctor, so much so that I think it would be a very good idea if I put together a few videos particularly around slang for doctors. So I will attempt to do that in the future for you. So that's a little bit about the English requirements for working as a doctor in Australia. Video question time. Do you find the English proficiency requirements for working as a doctor in Australia confusing? If so, what in particular is confusing to you? Leave a comment below and let me know. Also, are you intending to do one of these English tests? If so, which one? Why did you choose that one? Were there benefits of that one over another? I'd be interested to know. Leave me a comment below. So once again, thank you for watching the videos. We hope that you're finding them useful. If you are, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. Leave a like and leave a comment and tell your friends about us. Until next time, in the next video. Bye for now.